So I thought I'd talk a little bit about material sourcing and packaging design, as well as moving on to a little bit of how to frame new product innovation in a sort of responsible and ethical way regards sustainability. So I wanted, as usual, to sort of go through a range of books. These are by two good friends who are experts in what they do, the Chris Lefteri studio, and also Zoe Laughlin, the essentially Institute of Making. It's well worth checking out in London. And in many ways, if this is like the hands-on playground, this is, should we say, the corporate specialist design studio. But I would say neither one is right or wrong. It's just about approaching things differently. But these are both excellent reasons to come to London to check it out. Also wanted to basically quickly go through a little bit of Rob Thompson's graphics and packaging design production book. I'm not going to go into it blow by blow because I've already said how much love and respect I have for Rob Thompson's work. So in many ways, it's a like, if you like that manufacturing processes for materials for design professionals, you're going to love this. But I thought I'd also just talk a little bit about architectural model making and why, essentially, if you're wondering where the cool new stuff is, yes, go fishing in these books, but actually most architectural studios are just chock full of random craziness long before anyone has figured out a really good thing to do with it. And then I've had so many students ask me, like, where do I start? I want to be a sustainable, ethical designer. I'm like, yeah, cool. In the nicest possible way, it's easier said than done. And I would say in some ways a rite of passage is reading what looks like an old dusty book. But I don't think this book has really ever gone out of, should we say, relevance. So I'd love to just say a quick word about that. Anyway, jumping into let's jump into the materials side of things. So again, I think I'm going to touch on this briefly, which is Material Matters by Zoe Laughlin and Philip Howes. Essentially, the key points for me is that this book is great at just giving really, really fun examples. And if you ever see Zoe, who was also on Big Life Fix with me, she's just huge fun, energy, enthusiasm, and absolutely crazy intelligence on knowing all these sorts of things, and her brain is like this repository which can knit together all sorts of incredible opportunities and lateral applications for materials. So I'd say in some ways this book is the tip of the iceberg, and please try and get yourself down to Institute of Making. They have public open days at the weekend where you can do all sorts of weird things like make thermite explosions, Malteser ramps. You can do stuff with liquid nitrogen. It's just endless what they play with, and it really is the playground. So there's all the stuff like sort of shape memory alloys, all the stuff you'd expect to see in a materials science book, but then there's also a ton of stuff that you think, what the heck is this? And I think that's what's great about Zoe's sort of fascination for things that are almost more borderline art and play. And I think a little bit relating to some of my earliest points on innovation, I think that's actually where stuff really gets going and gets exciting. So don't be fooled by some of the whimsy that may appear in the book. I think it's often the precursor to something which is a lot more industrial, which is kind of the remit of Chris and his team. So all sorts of stuff like, she's broken it down into material classes. And again, some of those classifications might surprise you. And I think that's in some ways a good provocation. So needless to say, it's a good, robust book. It doesn't just say, here's the cool, sexy picture. It gives you links of where you can go, follow up more, and dare I say, possibly try and wing yourself some samples to have a go with. And I think, again, the playfulness of, I hadn't even seen this until I saw this book, of non-fired ceramics. So, this is getting pretty unusual stuff that, I think it's just one of those things where even if you didn't think this is necessarily going to be adopted by the mass markets, I think it's one of those things that provokes good questions and interesting new twists on familiar themes. So, yeah, I'm basically advocating art and play as a mechanism to get familiar and have that tacit appreciation for a new material. I think if you ever needed to labour a case study at maybe your boss or someone else who you're having to convince, I forget the company, whether it was DuPont or 3M, but I know that basically the foam that is in your car seats languished in R&D for 10 years because no one had figured out what to do with this expanding foam, until they realised that its density would be perfect for car seats. Because actually, if you pay attention to these things, it's actually not very comfortable for general upholstery for your sofas. Your sofas need more give and more squishiness, but actually your car seat is there to kind of keep you from not falling asleep and, dare I say it, give you impact protection should the worst happen. So again, you know, these things aren't always obvious. They're obvious in hindsight. And of course, just to be fair, this is not all fun and games. It's got serious critiques of things like PET, which, you know, couldn't be in hotter debate now, as this is the stuff that Coca-Cola bottles, to quite deliberately name a brand, is churning out billions of these things a year. All the sort of Evian waters, all this sort of stuff. Do we need it when you could just get, you know, in most developed countries, a perfectly good tap water? So again, these sorts of discussions, this book is absolutely great for. And I won't go through copywriting by showing too much, but as you can see, it's also a delightful book to, should we say, break a little bit of a creative block sometimes. So again, as I said, Chris's at a glance looks very, very similar, but I think it's also got, should we say, a little bit more critique going on in it in a sort of more designed fashion. So I really love the fact that it has these plus and minus. So we're looking at something like rock maple here. And obviously, you know, it's a little bit questionable whether it's going to take the world by storm as a new bread knife. And so he's put a bit of critique on the realities of these sorts of things. You know, interestingly, it can cause allergies, and it's susceptible to insect attack. Again, I was just reading a book recently about the difference between ash versus maple in baseball bats. Maple tends to crack and split down the bat, whereas maple has the risk of exploding if it's not properly kiln dried. So again, I think this is the sort of thing that's really interesting to get into, is not just the idealized lab condition, but actually real world examples. So again, I think the book, I don't know when it was published, 2014, so reasonably recent. But again, don't forget, it's a tough backlog keeping abreast of all these things. But, you know, bacterial cellulose, is it going to take the world by storm in 4 years? I haven't seen a whole ton of it. So I guess it's one of those things that's evolving slowly. And again, referring to the, you know, the minus, still in development, not commercially available, not yet waterproof, pretty big issue if you live in the UK, I can tell you. So it's one of those things where, again, if you live in a country that tends to not necessarily need a lot of waterproofing, or it's applied to a textile that is usually worn or utilized indoors, do you essentially design out the issue and the shortcoming? So I think these books are still really interesting. And I think, you know, cork, for example, having seen, you know, can suffer from dated price cut associations. I think that's, again, something which, you know, that at the minute of the time of putting this video up, there's definitely a lot more interest in cork, even though it, of course, has some limitations. So I think take these books with a pinch of salt, but I think they're terrific stimulus for seeing things differently, such as, would you believe you could make an orange peel utensil? And I think, again, I deliberately picked this one not because I think this is the future of sustainable industrial design, but because it's kind of like a gimmick and an art piece. But I would say this still has its place. And I think even though it's easy to throw stones at Electrolux, I think if it gets the right discussions going and moves us to them seeing an uplift in consumer interest, so that essentially senior people in the company can believe it's worth taking a punt on, then I think that's all good progress. Again, quick nod to my old company that I used to work at Sugru. I think, again, it still really does try to also champion some unusual things that are on the fringe, as well as things that are sort of, you know, good industry standards, which I think if you're fresh out of uni, it all seems a little bit of a blur, and you think, gosh, I really only know, you know, PPP and PET, what else is there? And so I think it gets into some of the more unusual things, which are actually very widely and sensibly deployed, but for certain applications over others. And I think, again, this is like a great example with the Canon camera, is just really sort of, the picture says so much of what the capability of magnesium alloys is. This is obviously ultra lightweight, very strong, and very high detail and definition. So I think that's where it does a good job. And then, of course, this sort of sense of, did you know, boron carbide, obviously exceptionally hard and sort of strong. So again, it's sort of that nice mix of knowing your onions in industry, whilst at the same time, throwing a few surprises as well. So I think those two are terrific books. So again, going through Rob Thompson, again, as I said, huge fan of his. Really good combination of breaking down all the sort of essentially pros and cons and considerations in more of a sort of qualitative approach, as in, A compared to B, as opposed to $5 versus $3. But you can see, obviously, he's referencing some pretty heavyweight companies like Apple, how they've used it creatively over the years. Obviously, things go in and out of fashion. And I think sometimes the things that you take for granted, like basically plastic bags, how do they get made? How do you get writing on something like this? Why is it that they're so cheap? So I think all these things are sort of really interesting to actually see. And I mean, I think Rob seems to have found himself the best job in the world to go around visiting all these sorts of things. Certainly looks like a dream for me of nerding out on how things are done. But having actually gone through a project at Sugru of having to do die cutting, where I had to learn how die cutting was done, and so hence design in accordance with that, or at least if I was going to bend the rules, I knew that I was bending a big rule and that it was going to cost. Getting into that sort of stuff, I think, is always going to help you in front of design managers, that you've at least considered the full process. So if you're asking for something that's a bit crazy, it at least it's not because of naivety, it's because of the research you've done. So again, I think you don't always get taught it at uni. You can't teach everything. Take it in that sense, not a critique of unis, but things like offset lithography, it's not relevant if you're doing pure product design, until you realize you really need to understand packaging, and you can get completely different results having a bit of knowledge in that area. So again, just overviews of inkjet printing, pros and cons. And I think what I love as well is that he gets into a little bit of the considerations for designers, notes for designers. So just overview of each of these colored sections here. And I think that's just a really good way of not patronizing, but just saying you can't have everything for free. So you have to consider the time, the cost, the spec, the complexity. So I think it's just a terrific overview. And I think even though it does lift some of the stuff from manufacturing processes for design professionals, it's still a really worthy, 80% of this book is fresh and relevant. So yeah, as mentioned, if we're looking at going after materials, and it's not just about all that book, I think architects are a great place to look for. And I think it's not so much, this is a great book as an accompaniment to sort of prototyping techniques, which I reviewed earlier. But I think, as you can see, going from cardboard techniques all the way through to sort of how they've used different cast resins, using things like, old classics like clay models, all the way through to, etched metal sheets, through to little soldering things to sort of get a quick result. So I think what's really exciting about a lot of sort of architecture practices is their desks. I've never seen an architect with clean desks. They've always got swatches of little bits of plastic or resin or concrete or whatever, and so I think they're huge nerds, as a sweeping generalization, about materials and material science. And unlike, say, artists, they actually have to know the physical engineering side as well. So not to be down on artists, but I think there's a spectrum of seeing something as just pure opportunity. But, I think architects are that nice balance of seeing the creative opportunity, but understanding some of the caveats and limitations of any material. So again, I think they're just terrific. And when you see these end results, of a building, it's usually a ton of different materials that have been deployed sensitively either to the prototype or as samples that accompany it to evoke what the final result would be. And I think that as a technique and a strategy for engaging the room, I think architects have always understood how to do that and play that well. So a good resource. Okay, so anyway, to sort of finish off the point that I'm saying, you can go through getting excited about all these great things you're going to create and bring forth into the world. I think Victor Papanek isn't there to put a dampener or be pessimistic and heavy, but at the same time, I think he gives a really responsible articulation of where the trade-off is between you creating something and understanding its impact and ramifications, because by creating something of desire, you naturally are a drag and a pull on resources. So how do you sort of consider that? And I think, a lot of his, sort of provocations, and it's quite a fun book. There's a lot of silly illustrations and a lot of serious illustrations, but, the guy really does start off with what is design. And take you through, and I mean, some of his quotes are sort of great, of Lao Tzu, all the way through to Oscar Wilde. There's a Picasso one later on. But I think the point is he's that really nice mix of getting the point home for you without feeling like you're just being scolded and you should never have studied design or or any of these things because you're poisoning the world. I think he still takes ultimately an optimistic view of the design profession, but just gives some things that sort of say we should maybe consider a little bit closely. I think he's quite scathing of, as you can see, the industrial designer begin by eliminating excess decoration. His real job, he uses his a lot, began when he insisted on dissecting the product, seeing what made it tick, and devising means of making it tick better, then making it look better. And I think he continually goes back and forth between what he perceives is a necessity, but also sort of trying to strip away things which are, should we say, a little bit subjective. I guess you can argue just as easily that where would we be without marketing, and all of that is subjective. Color is subjective. Otherwise we would just have, nicely rounded edges and shades of grey. So I think take from it the useful bit, even if some of the, should we say, heavy-handed side of it you could probably skip over. And I think, dare I say it, there's some stuff which, if you've seen Fight Club, the film, there's a scene where Brad Pitt is giving a reality check to Edward Norton, that essentially the car industry wouldn't bother taking something off sort of public release if it realized that the cost of the lawsuit was significantly a smaller percentage than the cost of the recall. And so I appreciate it's a very cynical take. I'd like to think that maybe isn't the truth, but there is some honesty that, Robert F. Kennedy also says the truth is that engineers are not asked to design for safety. Further inaction will be criminal, for it will be with the knowledge that our actions can make a difference, that auto deaths can be cut down, and that the slaughter on our highways is needless waste. It is time to act. And I think in many ways, as much as I wouldn't want to put a sort of parallel between the death of individuals and debate that with the social responsibility towards our planet, I think at the same time you can connect the dots that if you are Coca-Cola, you are having a very definite impact on those resources, the people either farming or cultivating or mining those things. And I think, as a designer in this generation, you just can't sign off in total ignorance of those factors. So I think brands will only have to respond more acutely to being transparent, showing that there is ethics throughout their entire process, all the way through to sourcing, and of course end of life, and how to make it responsible in that respect. So I feel this book still hasn't really lost a lot of its potency, even if some of the examples feel a little bit dated. So again, I think there's a nice sort of little point that I feel underpins a lot of, shall we say, the materials books. And I hope it's some sort of like a little bit of solace that even Picasso, as quoted by Gertrude Stein, says, when you make a thing that is new, it is so complicated making it that it is bound to be ugly. But those who make it after you they don't have to worry about making it, and they can make it pretty, and so everybody can like it, and when others make it after you. So basically, it's the thing I sort of feel that is, you know, worth considering with these books is that they're showing you that some of the examples where people have figured out an application, but it's by no means the end of the journey. And so I think that's a healthy way to view these books in general, is with a long-term social and global conscience, but I think also still remaining playful and up for playing with all sorts of different incredibly exciting materials to bring new ideas to life. So I hope that's useful. Thanks very much. Bye.